books out, if you will, go ahead and mark number 936. 936. Be our invitation song. Then we'll turn to 867. 867. To Canaan's land I'm on my way, where the soul never dies. My darkest night will turn to day, where the soul never dies. No sad farewell, no tears dim eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies. A rose is blooming there for me, where the soul never dies, and I will spend eternity where the soul never dies. No sad farewell, no tear dim eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies. I'm on my way to that fair land where the soul never dies, where there will be no parting hand and the soul never dies. No sad farewell, no tear dim eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies. Good evening. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to the midweek Bible study here at the Boston Church of Christ. I guess I need to take this advice. If you have a mobile device, please silence it right now before we have our services, if you can think about it. Tommy McGee, they sit on the board there. I guess you saw he had surgery in Arlington, and he's doing good. Wayne Hardage had a brief stay. Now, did he have a heart attack? Yes. I guess if I had a heart attack, that'd be the way I'd want to have one. He's already out and home. If you had to have one, I believe that's what road I'd take. So is he at home? Is he with Joy, or is he home by himself, or do we know?
Joy's with him.
Okay, Joy's with him, but he is at his house here.
That's what she told me today, that he was going home.
Okay. So that's what we got right now at this time. Are there any other announcements other than our shut-ins, the ones that have sicknesses? Yes.
I talked to Sean Hurley today, and he sounded really good. He's about normal, but he did lose that little bit of his vision, his peripheral vision, top, and he said they think it might come back.
That's a blessing.
But
So
he sounded really good.
that's Sean Hervey, that's Becky's nephew?
Yeah, he's going back to work in 3 to 6 weeks.
Okay, so
I
that's,
don't know what we do, we got him at school.
so we heard that about Sean. Is there anybody else that we need to hear from or know about tonight? Of course, we're still asking for to let us know if you have a graduate this year in office would like to know it. Ladies' night out's on the 14th, and of course there is a sign about learning the volunteers from Learning to Serve, or the teachers will be honored with a banquet on May 25th at 5:30 p.m. What is the 25th? Is that on a Friday night? Saturday. Okay. Mother's Day is Sunday. Learning to Serve is on the 19th. Do we have any other announcements before we go to our Heavenly Father in prayer? Dear Lord, we thank you for this day and our many blessings. We just please forgive us where we fall short. Help us to do better and keep you in mind and realize what all that you have done for us because you love us so much. Guide us back Sunday and help us tonight to learn everything that he can and help the speaker of the hour and help Kevin to be able to get across everything to us that he intends to. Help us to listen attentively and apply it to our lives. Be with those that had surgery, be with those that had illnesses and help them. Help us to go see about them and see about their needs and help them with anything that they need. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right, so this evening in our adult class we'll be in the book of Job, and we'll be looking at Job chapters 3 and following. Last week we introduced the book of Job a little bit and noted how Satan was behind Job's problems, although Job did not know that, and he attributes everything that happens to him to God. He doesn't know why God is doing the things to him that he thinks God is doing. His friends come around and they begin to accuse him of some heinous sin, and he professes his innocence, and they continue to accuse him because they have a particular model in mind of the relationship between suffering and sin. But nevertheless, Job asks a question in verse 20 of chapter 3. It's one of the key questions of the whole book of Job. And he says, "Wherefore is life given to him that is in misery, and life unto the bitter in soul?" And so it's a question that many people ask when they are suffering. Why am I alive? Why am I here? Why do I have this suffering in my life right now? And the answer to that question is found in the Bible. It's really the answer to why we are here in life to begin with. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13 gives us the answer in one place in the Bible. "Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." It is also stated in Deuteronomy chapter 6 in verses 4 and 5, where Moses writes, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, with all thy might." And then Jesus restates this in Mark chapter 12 and verses 29 through 31 when he is asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" And he answers, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind." And then he says, "The second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And so when we think about man's purpose, these are great sweeping answers that the Bible gives us. And at the end of the book of Job, although Job has been suffering all of this time, physically and emotionally, and also because of the doubts and questionings that his friends have put him under, at the end of the book, Job finally gets his audience with God. And what he finds out is that when he comes face to face with God Almighty, all the other suffering pales in comparison with the awe and the fear that he experiences in God's presence. And so Job's only answer at the end of the book is, "I repent in sackcloth and ashes," for all of the boasting that he did in seeking to have an audience with God, thinking that he would even be able to stand in God's presence. Of course, Job gets to that conclusion after a series of thoughts that he has in the book that we will explore as we study the book of Job. But one thing that we want to conclude on tonight is this: when all is said and done, nothing in this life, regardless of how much suffering we might experience, regardless of how much pain we might be in, regardless of how much toil we might have to go through or endure, nothing in this life will compare with coming face to face with the living God. And that is one of the great answers that the book of Job gives us. And so, when we think about the answer to Job's question, "Wherefore is life given to him that is in misery, and life and soul, the answer that the Bible gives is the same. To continue to love the Lord and to obey Him and to do His will, regardless of what circumstance we might be in. That is our only calling. And so tonight, as we think about that, we must understand that God is sovereign in all these matters. And regardless of where we might be, physically, emotionally, spiritually, we need to get in line with God's purposes, which is to fear Him and keep His commandments, or as put in Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4 and 5, to love Him with all our heart, soul, and might. And so tonight, if you need to begin to do that, we'd be happy to help you in that journey by hearing the words of Jesus and believing them and repenting of your sins, confessing Him as Lord, being baptized for the forgiveness of sins. You can become a Christian tonight, and you can begin a journey of loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, fearing Him and keeping His commandments. If you need the prayers of the church this evening because maybe you've fallen away from God and you want to come back this evening and make things right with Him, or maybe you have a prayer request of some sort, now choose this time to make those requests known as well. You can do that while together we stand and sing the song of encouragement.
I wander far away from God. Now I'm coming home. The paths of sin too long I've trod. Lord, I'm coming home. Coming home. Coming home. Nevermore to roam. Open wide thine arms of love. Lord, I'm coming home. My soul is sick, my heart is sore. Now I'm coming home. My strength renewed, my hope restored. Lord, I'm coming home. Coming home. Coming home. Nevermore to roam. Open wide thine arms of love. Lord, I'm coming home.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have tonight to study a portion of thy word, sing the song of praise to you. We ask that you be with the teachers, give them a rare recollection of those things prepared. Us as listeners, take those messages and apply them to our lives and go out and bring the word of Christ. We ask that you be with the ones mentioned tonight on our sick list and the ones that lost loved ones. Lord God, direct their lives and be with us for this our sake in Christ's name. Amen.
Some doctors are signed off. When they sign off, they put their sign off. I called out the power and they don't. Vacation, won't be back. I don't even see anything really bad.
Does anybody need a handout from last week, first of all?
Yes.
Last week. Those are from last week. We're not done with it yet, but I'm not preaching.
Oh, I was good.
Well, I could have, but I ain't thinking.
Okay, so last week we started looking at the book of Job. We introduced the book and gave a little bit of background information, and then we started chapters 1 and chapter 2. We got through chapter 2, and by the end of chapter 2 we're out of time, and so we didn't get to chapter 3, so let's go ahead and review just a little bit here, and then we'll get into chapter 3 tonight. We'll press on with chapters 4 and following a little bit later. We think about the background of the book of Job. We're thinking about the period of the patriarchs, the time of Abraham's father, Terah. And Job lived in the land of Uz, which was over there in the modern-day country of Iraq, the sort of the western portion. Job had many, many possessions. It is said that he had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, very large household. And of course he had servants, and he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and a great family. God says about Job that he was a righteous man, blameless, upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He says that in verse 8. And so that is the sort of the moniker that's put on Job here in the beginning of the book. In chapter 2, the Lord again says these things about Job, and as he is coming face to face with Satan here, Satan challenges the Lord and says, well, Job doesn't do those things without any reasons because you've hedged him in. And so you take away all those blessings from him, he's going to curse you. And so God permits Satan to do that, and Satan then allows all Job's possessions to be taken away. His family is killed, and all of his servants are destroyed except for a few. And he's left with his wife and whatever he has, and he still says, naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Again, this is one of the key themes of the book of Job, that no matter how difficult life gets, God's name is always to be blessed, and He is always to be praised. And we see that theme worked in through the book of Job in numerous places. And so we'll look at them as they come along. But here it states it at the outset of the book in verse 21. And also as we think about Satan's role here, that's another element that we get insight to at the beginning of the book here that as explains why Job is suffering the way that he does. So in Satan's first strike, he takes away all Job's possessions, family, and that. And then Job still blesses God. He doesn't curse God. And the Lord again meets with Satan in chapter 2 and says, have you considered my servant Job? Verse 3, there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and he still holds fast to his integrity, although although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. So then Satan doubles down, so to speak, and he says, well, I tell you what, God, if you will just afflict him personally, he will curse you. And you will see that he doesn't do these things for any reason at all. And so the Lord says, okay, but you are not allowed to take his life. And so Job then, Satan then afflicts Job with painful boils, it says, verse 7. And from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot. And this is, many scholars think this is something called black leprosy. And if you go and do a Google search on that, you'll find some really disturbing images that you will not get out of your head for a long time. So I don't recommend that you do that unless you are a stout constitution, you know, because it's really bad. So, but anyway, that's the kind of situation that Job found himself in. And it was very difficult, painful disease. And like it says, he took pieces of pottery and scraped himself to alleviate some of the suffering. The various different boils, I suppose, that he had were painful. And the only way he could get some relief was to get them to scrape them off of his skin, but of course that would leave some really raw areas on his body, and it would be really difficult to, in that condition as well. But he also put ashes on his skin. And Jim and I were talking about this after services, either last Wednesday or Thursday or something, and we were thinking about it. I guess ashes would be sanitary, in the sense that they are, you know, they've been purged by fire, and so they're going to be sterile. If he uses them quickly, you know, they're not going to be something that's going to infect. And I guess it would be almost like putting a salve to a certain degree on the wounds, you know, if they use those ashes quickly after they've cooled, and not, not after they've been sitting around for a while. But anyway, so ashes, people make soap, used to make soap from ashes too, right?
Lysol.
Lysol, yeah, you use ashes and some other lye and some other things, but you boil it, of course, but anyway. So that's what Job's condition is right now, and in the end of chapter 2, his wife says, curse God and die, verse 9. But he rejects her advice and says, shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips, verse 10 says. So now Job's friends come to visit him, and they don't even recognize him at first because his appearance is so changed, and because of the disease that he has. And they spent 7 days and 7 nights with him before Job began to speak. And so that kind of sets the stage for chapter 3. Now, in chapter 3, Job wishes that he had never been born, more or less, because he is suffering so severely at this point. And so that's what he says in this chapter. He curses the day of his birth, verses 1 through 10. He curses his birth itself in verses 11 through 19. And then he asks his first question, why do the living suffer? The key question there is verse 20, like we mentioned in our devotional time. Wherefore is light given to him that is in misery, and life unto the bitter in soul? So let's read chapter 3 together, and we'll just look at it. Now, a lot of this Hebrew poetry is, and a lot of this you need to understand, it's intentional reduplication of thought. And this was sort of the style poetry in that particular day and age. Today we would look at this and we would say, why do they say the same thing over and over and over again? Because we're a society that what is that, little snippets, what do they call those in the news and media and stuff? I can't remember, but anyway, just when you get just little snippets of information, and that's all we want, give us the bullets, and we're good. But don't go overboard.
You talking about the talking points?
Talking points or
Headline.
headlines, yeah, that kind of thing. Sound bites, that's what I was trying to think of, sound bites. Just that quick sound bite, that's all we need. We're ready to move on to something else, because that's how we are in our society. But in Job's society, they took time to talk about things, and they talked about it again and again and again. They would mull it over again and again. Yes.
Does it seem like in the first couple of chapters, Job is more concerned with God, he thinks God's left him, than he is with his losses in his personal misery?
Well, he thinks God has abandoned him to a degree, but and he wants an audience with God is what he ends up asking for. But yes, he doesn't understand why this is happening. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit, because it goes into their preconceptions about justice in that particular culture. And we'll talk about, and some of those preconceptions people still believe today. So Job is a very relevant book to us today, believe it or not, because a lot of the things that they think about in this book, we also sort of have notions of. And a lot of the thoughts that Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have, need to be removed from their thinking. So anyway, so let's look at the first chapter here. After this, chapter 3, verses 1 and following. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth, and Job spoke and said, "May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. Oh, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout come into it. May those curse it who curse the day. Those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. May the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light, but have none, and not see the dawning of the day, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes." And so there's the point that he's getting to there. But notice how many times he talks about, let that day be dark, more or less, and the many ways that he expresses that. Is that surprising to you that somebody would talk like that? I think it is to me, just from our perspective and our culture, But this is the way Hebrew poetry worked. They said the same thing over and over again to emphasize and to make the point. And then also, there's a tediousness to going through the book of Job. When you read through Job, it's hard to get through because it is tedious. And there's a reason for that. The writer of the book is trying to give you kind of a sense of, in just your words, but a sense in how difficult it was to go through what Job himself went through. And so it's intended to be tedious. It's supposed to be difficult to work through. It's not supposed to be easy. This is a book about suffering. And you, the reader, are supposed to do some suffering as you read through the book.
I have a question about verse 8.
Go ahead.
I was reading this, and the lazy way I did it, I asked Alexa, what does Leviathan mean?
All right.
Now, I know Leviathan's a book that Thomas Locke or Hobbes, one of the two wrote
Oh,
about
yeah.
government. But it also means sea monster.
Right, right.
So how does sea monster apply here?
Well, we'll get to the Leviathan at the end of the book. There's actually a longer description of the Leviathan at the end when God comes in and starts talking to Job about some things, and he describes the Leviathan in that part of the book in detail. And the point simply is this, that Leviathan is a large, very aggressive predator that lives in the ocean, and to try to take him on is basically a sentence of death. If you try to catch Leviathan and to kill him, you're going to die, more or less. And so that's when he says here in, where is it? Verse 8. He says, "May those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan." And so in other words, these are people who have a death sentence on them. They basically have a death wish because they want to go tackle Leviathan. They want to go arouse him, And so that's what he's talking about. And basically, so if you put it in those terms, you would say, "May those curse it who curse the day." And who are people who curse the day? People who are ready to go die. That's who curse the day, all right? And that's what that description, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan, means in this context. So, but that's what he's talking about there. All right? So he curses the day of his birth. Verse 3 is the key verse here. "May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived." Now, in verses 11 through 19, he curses his birth itself. And verse 11 is the key verse here. He says, "Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb?" And so he's actually in so much pain and so much suffering. He curses the day of his birth. He curses his birth. And he wonders, why am I even allowed to live anymore? And that's pretty much what he says at the end. But let's look at verses 11 through 19 here. "Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For now I would have lain still and been quiet. I would have been asleep. Then I would have been at rest with the kings and counselors of the earth, who built ruins for themselves, or the princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They do not hear the voice of the oppressor. The small and the great are there, and the servant is free from his master." Now, of course, Job is talking about death. That's what he's talking about here. And he's describing it from a mere physical perspective. He is not looking at death from a spiritual perspective like we have revealed to us in the New Testament. Jesus, Paul says, brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. Okay? And so it's through the gospel that we have a completely different perspective on death than people had back in Old Testament times. And so from Job's perspective, without the benefit of the revelation of Jesus and the message of the gospel, he looks at death as a place of rest and peace. And when you're dead, then you're at ease at that point. And that's basically how he describes it here, as being a place where it will be still, verse 13, and quiet, asleep, he describes it there, and then rest, who are with these kings and counselors of old, who gone before, and hidden, verse 16, like infants who never saw the light. There's no trouble there, verse 17, he says. The weary are at rest. The prisoners rest. They don't hear the voice of the oppressor anymore. And in death, it's the same for everyone. At least that's the way he describes it here. Now, Job isn't necessarily correct about what happens after death, okay? He is simply stating his perspective, how he sees it, with the information that he has, and we can't really fault him for that, because he does not know what comes after death. He does not know that there's a place reserved for the wicked and a place reserved for the righteous, and that the wicked are suffering, and that the righteous are blessed and taken care of. He does not know any of that. All he's concerned about is the physical. And so that's how he describes it here in these verses. Now, verses 20, by the way, if anybody has a question or comment, just go ahead and pipe on up and let that be known. Otherwise, I'm just going to press forward. But in verses 20 through 26 then, we see his first question, why do the living suffer? And that's verse 20. Why is life given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they can find the grave? Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes before I eat, and my groanings pour out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. And so now Job is describing his current state. And that is, of course, that he is in deep suffering. He is in great pain here. He wants to know why. Why do people experience pain, suffering, difficulty, and trouble, and all of those adjectives that we use to describe various different states of misery that we can be in, right? Think about the number of adjectives that we have to describe pain of one kind or another. It's quite extensive. And so Job is asking about that. And, I don't know that anybody doesn't ask questions like this when they are suffering. That's one of the first things that comes to your mind. If you're suffering and your pain is strong enough, you even start to wonder why you're even alive. And you may even start thinking about how you could end your life. That is very common when people are in a deep pain and anguish and misery. They do think about things like that. And so another aspect of the book of Job is it sort of opens up to us the mental state of someone who is in great suffering. And we can look at this and we can look at it and appreciate it from the standpoint that it's common that people who are in great suffering often have thoughts of suicide. Not that they would try to do that necessarily, but that the thought does cross their mind. Okay? Now, some people do commit suicide when they're under a tremendous amount of suffering and pain, and that's certainly an issue that is one that society grapples with today in our world. But when we ask the question, why is life given to him who is in misery and life to the bitter in soul? The answer, as we talked about earlier, is simply this: to fear God, to obey His commandments, to glorify God, to love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. However you want to put it, our existence, our purpose, regardless of what state of mind we might be in, it does not change our purpose. It does not change why we're here. And the answer is always the same. And that is to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves in the best way that we can possibly do that. And that can be very difficult at times when there is great suffering going on in our life. But nevertheless, that is still the purpose. And like I said earlier, when we get to the end of the book of Job, God does not accept Job's excuses. He does not look at Job and the pain that he is in and say, that's okay, Job, you're in a lot of pain and suffering, so don't worry about it. No, he doesn't. God holds Job completely accountable for everything that he said and for all of his actions during this time, regardless of the amount of suffering that he was in. And so when we think of it in those terms, God is absolute and he's sovereign. And so we're not going to be able to offer any excuses to God that some haven't tried to offer before. And so if God's not going to let Job get away with the things that he does, you think he's going to let us get away with it, And of course the answer to that is no, he's not. All right, so any questions or comments up through the first 3 chapters? Could I get your help again, Scott? I appreciate it. Right. We'll go ahead and pass out this next handout here. And I'll get the first 3 over here. And then verse 4. And you can get everybody else. They got yours. All right, so we'll move on to chapters 4 through 7 here. And we see the first argument against Job in chapter 4. And that is the argument that Eliphaz brings forth. Now, Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, are really interesting characters. Eliphaz is probably the most reasonable among them from the standpoint that he is the least in your face about things. And Zophar, Bildad is sort of in between Eliphaz and Zophar. He is the most blunt. He will just put it out there and say it like he thinks it. And sometimes some things that Zophar says are just downright offensive in the way that he handles himself. But Eliphaz is the most diplomatic, I guess we could say. And he is the first one who begins to speak. Now later on, when we encounter a character by the name of Elihu, who doesn't engage in the dialogues, he's just a individual speaker. He speaks and has his say toward the end, and then he doesn't talk anymore. But Elihu says that he waited because he wanted the older men to speak first. And so Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar evidently are among the older of Job's friends. They're the ones who are going to try to reason with Job here about his situation. So let's look at verses 1 through 6 here of chapter 4. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. Is not your reverence your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? And so, basically what Eliphaz is doing here in verses 1 through 6 is he's beginning to kind of question Job a little bit. Job, in the past, you've been the one to come in and give other people advice, but now it looks like it's your turn to get some advice, more or less, is what Eliphaz is saying. And so he's saying, look, when you put things the way you did in chapter 3, how can one hold back from saying something about that? And so he's going to have his say here. And basically he's saying, Job, it looks like you are now in the position of needing advice when you have been the one who have been giving the advice, and I'm just the guy to give it to you. That's is what he's saying here. And he also kind of questions Job's motives a little bit here when Job talks about, well, why am I suffering like this? And Eliphaz, he has something in mind already. He already thinks he knows why Job is suffering. And so his first little speech here, or his first little section here, verses 1 through 6, in essence, he's saying, Job, now really, you don't need to be saying the things that you say. You really know why you're suffering the way you are. And he's trying to sort of ease into that with what he says here in these verses. And so in verses 7 through 11, verses 1 through 6, he kind of questions Job's motives. In 7 through 11, he questions Job's innocence. Look what he says. Remember now who ever perished being innocent. Okay, so there's one of the key verses of the chapter. Who ever perished being innocent? And where were the upright ever cut off? So in other words, Job, in asking this question, basically what he's saying is, Job, guess what? There's a reason for your suffering, and it's not because you're innocent. It's because you have done something, and God is punishing you, okay? And that's what is happening here. And so he's being nice about it, but that's basically what he's saying, more or less. And, that's a thought that often goes through people's minds as well when they suffer, when they have problems. They think, well, God must be punishing me for something that I've done wrong, And one of the points of the book of Job is simply this, that God doesn't necessarily punish people for things that they've done wrong. And even doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the case that you can suffer as punishment. I'm putting this the wrong way. That it's not necessarily the case that your suffering is punishment. That's what I'm trying to say. That sometimes suffering is just suffering, and that there's no reason for it at all, and that God isn't behind it. He's not trying to punish you. You haven't really done anything wrong, but there's just a suffering. And in Job's case, the reason he's suffering isn't because he's done something wrong, but because he's done something right. Think about that for a minute. What did God say to Satan when he came to him? If you look at my servant Job, he's a great guy. He's upright. He's a good dude, And Satan was like, well, let's see what we can do about that, And so, a lot of times, suffering doesn't have anything to do with having done something wrong. It may have something to do with you're doing something right. And that's one of the great points that we find in the book of Job here. But that's what Eliphaz thinks. He thinks that Job has done something wrong. And of course, that's one of the first things that people think when they're suffering. I've done something wrong. I'm being punished. The Lord is getting me now, I've messed up real good this time. Well, look at verse 8. So this is what Eliphaz continues to say. Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. So you reap what you sow, right? And so, Job, here you are. You're just reaping what you've sown. And that's all that's happening here. Verse 9. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. The roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lion are broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. And so Eliphaz is describing Job's situation in terms of a lion, trying to make it kind of palatable, I guess. But, he's comparing Job with a lion and saying, Job, you're the lion, and it looks like your teeth have been broken, and your cubs have been scattered, and your lionesses have left you, more or less. And, yeah, go ahead.
Well, the thing was, he was using his judgment, his experience, we talked about his experience.
Oh, yes.
And that's where we get in trouble. And there's, what about, you sow what you reap?
Yes.
Well, that doesn't necessarily, or you reap what you sow.
Yeah, you reap what you sow.
And that's what he's kind of doing here. You must have done something wrong.
Right.
But he's limited. God is much more knowledgeable of what's going on than man is. And he's applying his wisdom to this situation, and he's wrong.
Right.
So we gotta be careful. We could apply our wisdom and we could be wrong.
That's right. We've got to be careful. We doesn't have all the information, you know. And that's another great point in the book of Job. Nobody in the book has all the information except God. He's really the only one who knows what's really going on with everything. And so that's why we really have to trust Him when we have trouble in life and we have difficulties, because, you know, we just don't have all the information. And nobody else does either.
And you know, this is probably pretty close to the argument that Job would have used if one of his friends had been in the situation.
Maybe
Not very
so.
much of
I
a
mean,
lesson
for
for Job himself that, you
Yeah.
know, you need to think back of what you've said to people. Look where you're at now.
Yeah, and Job later on, I think, if I'm not mistaken, later on, Job reflects a little bit
Yeah.
on some of the things that he's done.
So Job's going to come out of this
So-
whole experience a much better man.
Oh, he is. That's true. He really is.
Eliphaz has a lot of gall because he's playing some Monday morning quarterback for the guy.
Yeah. Well, but you see, this is the accepted wisdom of the day. All right. And we're going to see Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, all three of them. They're convinced that Job has some huge sin in his life that he's hiding, and until he confesses it, he's going to be suffering. And they all encourage him. They all say, Job, just fess up and tell, you know, confess your sin, and then God will alleviate you. He'll give you relief, you know. And that's pretty much their philosophy.
It's a wonder, it's a wonder he didn't go
means
off
of
on.
thinking about things. But it goes deeper than that, because this is their whole system of justice, okay? This is how they reason about the world. They believe that there is a one-for-one correspondence with the wrong that we do and the suffering that we have in this world. So that for every evil that is done, there is a corresponding amount of suffering that it entails. And if you're suffering, therefore, you must have done something wrong. And so that's kind of the philosophy that they go by in this day and time. And Job's going to bring up some examples later of some people who, in his experience, have done tremendous amounts of sins, and yet they have no suffering at all. And he's going to really think about this question of, well, is it true that for when we suffer, that we committed some kind of heinous sin or crime or something like that the reason why we're suffering, is that really the case? And one of the conclusions of the book of Job is that no, that's not necessarily the case. But that's the philosophy that they go by in this day and time. And they're going to press that philosophy as they keep continuing on. Let's see if we can get through the end of chapter 4 here. Now a word was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a whisper of it. And this is Eliphaz continuing to speak. He has a vision. He says, in disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed before my face. The hair on my body stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice saying, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? If he puts no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who dwell in the houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before a moth? They are broken in pieces from morning till evening. They perish forever with no one regarding. Does not their own excellence go away? They die, even without wisdom. What in the world is Eliphaz saying here, right? Well, he's claiming to have had some kind of vision in which a spirit spoke to him. And the spirit basically gave him this quote-unquote wisdom. And the wisdom that the spirit gave him was this, that, if people are perishable, then surely they're fallible. And so there's a relationship between their suffering and their sin is basically what he's getting at. And that's what he's trying to say here. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Well, of course a mortal can't be more righteous than God. Can a man be more pure than his maker? Well, of course not. That's not the case either. But you see, his conclusion from that doesn't necessarily follow from the premise. His premise is, mortals are not more righteous than God. Well, that's true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, therefore, because they're suffering because they've sinned. All right? That there's this one-for-one relationship between those things. But that's basically what he's getting at here. Because he says, if he puts no trust in his servants, he charges his angels with error. How much more those who dwell in the houses of clay? And so, basically what he's getting at is there's something inherently wrong about our existence. And we're going to see that in his reasoning, he comes awfully close to this notion of inherent sin. That sin is just part of our existence. And that's kind of what he's hinting at right here. That you're just kind of born into sin. And that because you're born in sin, that there's nothing you can do about it. And so therefore, you're going to suffer. Because sin and suffering go hand in hand. And that's basically what he's trying to say here. Verse 19, how much more those who dwell in the houses of clay? How much more what? How much more will God charge them with error? Okay, is what he's saying there. Who are crushed before moth, they are broken in pieces from morning till evening. They perish forever with no one regarding. They die even without wisdom. See, so he says, that right there is proof that mankind is inherently sinful and that therefore all suffering is a result of our sin in a very personal kind of way. All right? And that's what he's trying to get at. Now he continues that thought in chapter 5, and we'll get into that hopefully next week. He's going to support his conclusion with some examples here. In verses 1 through 7, he's going to urge Job to acknowledge God's vengeance and confess, like we mentioned earlier, verses 8 through 16. And then he's going to urge Job to acknowledge God's punishment and be delivered. And he thinks that if Job will do that, then God will deliver him from his suffering in verses 17 to 27. So we're not done with Eliphaz's argument yet here. But nevertheless, that's basically what he and Bildad and Zophar are going to be arguing for. They're going to be saying that, Job, you've sinned, you've done something horribly wrong, because the amount of suffering that you're experiencing must have meant that you really committed a whopper. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
Quote Psalm 51:5.
Psalm 51:5. That's where David is talking about his sin. I think he said, "In sin did my mother conceive me," and something like that. Yeah, I think that's what that is. But but that particular passage is kind of a what do they call it when you exaggerate from the sake of metric?
Hyperbole.
Hyperbole. That's hyperbole. All right. Because if you look at the whole context, it's impossible, some of the things that he says